Hello again, everyone. So I had a question on one of my recent videos asking about Manx folklore, and I'm really not that knowledgeable about Manx folklore in particular. Most folklore, most fairy lore is very culturally specific. So I know a great deal about Irish fairy lore and folklore. I know a decent amount about Scottish because they're kind of closely interrelated in a lot of ways, and I've done a lot of research, particularly into the 17th century, the early modern Scottish fairy beliefs and the intersection with witchcraft and the witch trials. So I know a lot about the Irish. I know a decent amount about the Scottish. I know some Welsh, not a lot, but some. But when we start to get into like Cornwall, the Isle of Man, Brittany, I have some knowledge in those areas, but it's really not my primary focus, and it's not an area I am extremely knowledgeable in. And this is definitely a subject where you need to be extremely knowledgeable, I think, to get sort of any in-depth thing going on. So that all said, I did still want to sort of answer the question, talk more about Manx folklore. If you're interested in Manx folklore, there's a really good Facebook page called Culture Vannin, which is specifically focused on Manx culture. They do share a lot of cultural things, folklore, fairy lore, all of that. So I would encourage people to check that out if it's a subject that interests you. My own resources are very sad and also very old. So I have this book, Manx Fairy Tales by Sophia Morrison. This is from 1911. This is obviously a reprint, a modern reprint, but the original is from 1911. And then I have Irish, good Lord, I have Ireland on the brain apparently. Fairy Tales from the Isle of Man. And this one is by Dora Broom. And this is 1953. So 1911, 1953. The majority of my sources, and again the Culture Vannin page, and whatever shows up in some of the books like Catherine Brake's work, where she discusses things like Glashton and specific Manx fairy beings. So I have some limited knowledge in this area, not my expertise though, which is I want to make that clear before we get into this. So there are really three main stories that I know from Manx folklore. One is about the Leannan Sidhe. I've done an extensive amount of research on Leannan Sidhe folklore, both Irish and Manx. The majority of what people think is Leannan Sidhe folklore is actually coming from the Manx. W.B. Yeats kind of took the Manx folklore. He does discuss it in his Celtic Twilight, but then he really got super creative with the Irish based on the Manx. And what he talks about for the Leannan Sidhe is really not what the Irish Leannan Sidhe is, or the concept of it is. Different things. But because of that, I have done a lot of research in that area, and I'm familiar with the Manx Leannan Sidhe stories and beliefs. Because I have also done a good amount of research about changelings across the Celtic language speaking cultures, I do also know a couple Manx changeling stories. So I figure I'll just share those with you here today, kind of give you a feel for it. I do encourage people, if this interests you, like I said, those two books are an option, the Culture Vannin page is an option. Manx folklore is a little more difficult and obscure to research. Obviously, sources from the Isle of Man are your best bet. I would encourage people to look at those. So, the Manx Leannan Sidhe. Leannan Sidhe, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it in Manx because I'm saying it more the way you would say it in Irish, is a word, a term that literally means fairy lover or fairy sweetheart. The Manx story that I'm aware of for the Leannan Sidhe is there was a young man, and he was coming home one night, and he heard a Leannan Sidhe. He heard a fairy woman around him sort of sighing and trying to get his attention. And he knew that he should not look at her, that if he looked at her, he would fall under her enchantment. He would be enthralled by her. So he kept his eyes down and refused to look at her. And this went on for several nights. Anytime he would be out walking at night, the fairy woman would appear, walking around him and sighing sadly, trying to get his attention, and he would look down and refuse to look at her. The third night that this happened, she seemed to give up and walked past him, and he sort of glanced up and saw, and then he ended up following her. He saw her going to this chest and opening it and then closing it and then hiding it. And he did, of course, what any human would do in that situation. He went over and looked into the chest, and it contained a piece of gold and some golden hair. And he took it. Stealing from fairies, always a great idea in these stories. He took it and he buried it underneath an elder tree, because the belief was that the fairy folk could not go near the elder tree. So he buried it there so she could not get it back. And next night, again, she appeared following him. This time, though, when he went to his home, she went outside his home and was moaning and sighing and looking in the windows, and he's doing his best to ignore her. And then this begins to be the pattern. Every night she's outside the windows, she's crying, she's trying to get his attention. And eventually he decides, you know what, I need to get married. If I get a human wife, then this fairy woman will leave me alone. So he goes to one of the other men near where he lived, who had several daughters, and he says, can I marry your daughter? And the man says, no. He says, my daughter's not for you. Why don't you go marry this other woman? And, basically says, you're not good enough for my daughter. So the man then says, well, I have gold, so I am good enough for your daughter. I have money. And the father says, well, show me the gold, basically. So the man goes and he digs up the chest from underneath the elder tree. He brings it and he shows it to the girl's father. And the father says, well, first of all, you need to take that golden hair and throw it in the water, because that is certainly mermaid's hair. You don't want to keep that. And he said, but take the gold and go to this other town and go to these specific people, and they will give you money for it, cash for it, and then you can marry my daughter. So he does as the father suggests. He goes, gets rid of the mermaid hair, sells the gold, comes back with the money, and the man allows him to then marry the daughter. He gets married, and the first night goes well enough, but they can hear the Leannan Sidhe crying around the house. And the new wife says to him, what is that noise? And he says, oh, it's nothing. It's just the wind around the eaves. So the second night, the Leannan Sidhe reappears crying, and the wife is like, no, that is definitely a person. Who is that? What is going on? And the man says, no. It's just the curlew. It's just this bird crying. It's fine. Don't pay any attention to it. Now the third night comes, and the new wife needs to go back to her family home because her mother is ill, to help care for her mother. So the new husband, the man, is left alone. And this time he glances up and out the window just as the fairy woman is looking in, and he sees her face. And it is the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. Beautiful as the moon, beautiful as the night sky. And he cannot look away. He immediately follows her, goes out of the house and follows her, and the two disappear. Now, 7 years go by. This is a significant number in a lot of fairy stories. 7 years go by, and the man finally manages to break free from the fairy woman, the fairy lover, and returns to his home. But when he looks in the window, he sees the woman he had married with a baby in the cradle and a strange man in the house. Of course, he gets upset. So he flings open the door and says, what have you done? Why have you married someone else? And the woman says, I don't know who you are. My first husband wandered off into the night 7 years ago and drowned, and, was never found, never seen again. And I waited 5 years for him, but then 2 years ago I remarried. This is my new husband and my child. and the man kind of turns and catches sight of himself in a reflective surface. I believe in the story it's like a brass or a bronze pot or pan that's hanging up, and he sees himself as this aged, withered, white-haired old man, and sort of in horror turns and runs back into the night, where the Leannan Sidhe immediately then takes him back and never heard from again. So the point of this story, where we get a lot of folklore here, is, you're not supposed to look at the Leannan Sidhe. There are other stories, other versions of the story, where the man eventually rips his shirt and blindfolds himself so he won't physically be able to look at her. That if you look at her, you immediately fall into her enchantment. You can't resist it, and she will take you off. And there's some implication there in the fact that he was gone for 7 years, but when he came back, he was old and withered and aged, that she was like draining his life force in some way, because he'd been a young man when he left. So interesting Leannan Sidhe material there. That's definitely a very Welsh perception of it. Welsh. I don't know why I want to keep saying Welsh today. Manx perception of it. Not Welsh. Manx. Sorry. It's definitely a very Manx perspective on it. And it is something that we kind of see uniquely there. There is some other Manx folklore. I don't have examples of specific stories. These are things that I have read, for example, in Catherine Briggs, that the Manx Leannan Sidhe is more overtly vampiric. Some implications that she might actually drink blood of the victims. We don't see that in that story, and that's the only story that I personally am familiar with. So that's that. Now, the changeling stories, like I said, I know 2 of them. One is more an example of the fairies being tricky and like their sense of humor. This couple had always wanted a child, had never been able to have one. The man is out riding home one night, hears an infant crying, goes and looks, and there in the bushes on the side of the road, he finds a baby, as you do apparently sometimes, and he picks it up and he decides he's going to bring it home, and rides home with his infant in his arms, crying, gets to his home, calls his wife out, all excited, come see what I found. The wife comes out, and when they go to look in the blanket the baby had been wrapped in, there's just a block of wood. And the man, of course, is baffled and horrified, and then they hear laughter all around them, and they hear the fairies crying out in Manx, something to the effect of, how foolish are you to mistake a block of wood for a baby? And the fairies apparently thought this was a hilarious joke. It's their sense of humor. And that's sort of that story. It's just a little short snippet of a story, but changeling story. It's very common in a lot of changeling stories for the changeling to actually be an inanimate object like that. A block of wood, a log, a stick, something of that nature. The second story I know is a little more involved, and it has a lot more clear connections to some of the wider Celtic language folklore about changelings. In this story, there was a woman, and she gave birth to a fine, beautiful baby. When the baby was 2 weeks old, she went to get water from her well, and she left the baby alone and forgot to put the iron tongs from the fire in the cradle, which is a traditional protection against fairies taking a baby or interfering with them. She forgot to do it. When she came back, the baby all of a sudden is crying all the time, hungry all the time, can't be calmed down, like the worst colicky nightmare you can imagine. And the woman doesn't really know what to do with this, is just doing her best to take care of the baby. Some time goes by, and a tailor comes around, someone who traveled and offered to do tailoring work in every place he went. And the woman offers for him to stay with her and to do some sewing work that she needs done. And while he's there, she says to him, I need to go, run an errand. Keep doing what you're doing, keep sewing, but if you could watch the baby in the cradle. And he agrees he will. So the baby's in the cradle fussing. He's sitting there sewing, and he starts to hum a hymn. And it's pretty well known across folklore that the good folk do not tend to be fond of anything Christian. Hymns, prayers, people calling on the Lord's name, things like that. So he starts to hum this hymn, and he hears this voice speaking out saying, enough of that, stop. And he looks up and he's like, is that you, the baby in the cradle? And the baby says, yes. So he goes back to his sewing and continues to hum this hymn. And the baby again speaks up and says, no, enough. I don't want to hear that. Sing something cheerful. Play something cheerful. So the tailor, still sewing, is like, all right. And he starts sort of humming, singing a jig, a dancing tune. And the baby in the cradle sits up and says, oh, that's much, much better. That's much, much better. And so the tailor says, would you like to dance to it? Clearly the tailor had kind of caught on that this baby was actually a fairy. And the baby in the cradle says, oh, yes, clear all the chairs and all the tables and get that fiddle down and play for me. So the tailor does this, gets the fiddle down, starts playing. The baby leaps out of the cradle and starts dancing merrily all around the kitchen. And then after a certain amount of time, stops and says, oh, she's coming back. Set everything back the way it was. Leaps back into the cradle. Tailor puts the fiddle away, picks his sewing back up. And the woman comes in and sort of looks at the baby fussing in the cradle, looks at the tailor, who is clearly very freaked out, and says, something strange must have gone on while I was out. And the tailor says, well, why don't you get more wood for the fire, wood and ferns? And so the woman, not really understanding why he's asking for this, but the woman goes and does it. She brings the things in, and he starts stoking this fire to ridiculous levels, really encouraging it to be as big and as fiery as it can be, until the woman finally says, like, what are you doing? Are you trying to burn my house down, like, with a fire like that? And he says, no, you'll see. And then the baby, who had been crying in the cradle, starts to, instead of crying, making these sort of like alarmed cry noises, alerting the fairies to come and get it back. And so the man goes over, ready to grab the baby, to put it in the fire, which is unfortunately a very common way to deal with changelings, and the reason that a lot of changeling anecdotes in real life involve murder of infants, or children, or adults. So he goes to grab the baby, and the baby leaps out of the cradle and says, no more of this. I'm done with you. And runs out of the house. The tailor and the mother go chasing after it. And when they get outside, there's nothing to be seen, but they can hear a great sound, like a huge number of birds in the air, like wings and cries and all this noise. And the tailor turns to the mother and says, well, that's the fairy gone now. And the mother thanks him, for relieving her of this changeling who has now fled. And when they turn around then to go back into the house, they hear sort of a normal, soft baby cooing noise. And the mother looks over and sees her own child, who had been taken, laying in sort of a little mossy area, as perfectly normal and calm as he had been at the start before she'd lost him. And of course she goes over then and retrieves him, and everyone's happy. And that's a pretty common changeling story. We see multiple versions of that across Ireland, Wales, Scotland, pretty much everywhere there's changeling stories. The idea that it's the tailor that sort of undoes the changeling is something we find across folklore, something about tailors. Sometimes it's a piper in some of the Scottish stories, but often it's a tailor. So some kind of magic going on there. In most of the stories we find in other places, it's something like the tailor will tell the mother to boil water in an eggshell, and that'll get the fairy to reveal itself, because then it'll, cry out like, oh, I'm 1,000 years old and I've never seen that before. Things like that. This one is a little different because it's one of the few folk tales where we see the changeling being threatened directly with fire. We see that a lot in anecdotal accounts. We see that a lot in folk belief. We don't see it as often in the actual stories. In the stories, usually it's more about tricking the changeling into revealing itself, and then once it reveals itself, it has to go. Reveals itself specifically to the family, the mother or father that it's living with. Obviously, the tailor or some random extra adult, it can have a conversation with them or get up and dance, and it's fine. But that idea, and the idea that if you can force the changeling to acknowledge what it is, to admit that it's a fairy or to flee, then the real human baby will be returned. That's a very common motif around changing folklore. So those are really the only Welsh fairy stories that I know. Like I said at the beginning, it's not really my forte. It's not the main thing I've studied. The reason I know those stories is because I've studied subjects related to them, the Leannan Sidhe and the changelings. And so I've learned a few of these Manx folk tales, but not really my main specialty. Like I said at the beginning, I encourage people, if Manx folklore interests you in particular, check out Culture Vannon. I believe they also have a website, but I know they have a Facebook page. And potentially these two books, with the understanding that these are old, particularly the 1911 one. I always get a little hesitant with Victorian and Edwardian era sources because they tend to be really dodgy. This one is from the 1950s. May or may not be better. I'm sure there are better sources for Manx folklore out there. It's just not, because it's not my main interest, it's not something I have a lot of resources on. But at least it gives people a starting place if the subject interests you. Also, of course, always be aware that regional fairy lore, regional fairy beliefs, and cultural fairy beliefs are different. So the beliefs, for example, in the Leannan Sidhe, in the Isle of Man, on the Isle of Man, are not the same as what we find in Ireland. They're actually profoundly different. So just be aware. You can't sort of carry over. There's certain things like the changeling stories, because they're a very widespread motif, that we can see common themes. But even in that, as I mentioned, the specific stories are different. They can include different aspects. The idea of finding a baby on the side of the road and bring it home, and then it's a changeling. I've only ever run across that in that Manx story. That's not usually how it happens in most other stories. And in the other one, the idea of directly threatening the changeling with this immense fire that you've built up is something I've only really seen more in that Manx story. It's not something you find in most of the others. So even in stories that are kind of shared and common between cultures, there can be very significant differences. And you can't sort of just assume everything is going to be the same. Just a little note here at the end. But Manx folklore, that's what I know about it when it relates to fairies. Again, I realize it's not much, but hopefully that was at least interesting, and it's a little bit of material and some fun stories for your day. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. If you have any specific things you would like to see me do videos on, pop that in the comments too. I do try to always check and see when I get comments on videos, and I could end up doing it in the future. You never know. So I hope that was entertaining or educational or interesting for today, and I will see everyone hopefully soon.